Okay, I'm going to say just a few words before I introduce Shad, Agnieszka and Robin, and I will be very brief. It's important that we understand one dynamic, I think, when thinking about prisons in the north of Ireland. And the dynamic is this. Some of you will have heard about the word devolution, and we have a devolved assembly. It's not fully devolved, it never will be fully devolved in the foreseeable future, but devolution of policing and justice powers occurred only this year. And at the very time that was being debated, we were holding a conference in this very room on the devolution of justice and policing. And I think people thought we managed to get the timing right on purpose. It was a total coincidence. I would say, wouldn't I, that the debate and discussion in that conference, which drew on community representatives, drew on ex-prisoners, drew on a whole range of people who have been active in the north on policing and justice, from official agencies and non-governmental organisations. The discussion in the debate in that conference was far more refined, far more in-depth, far more developed than that amongst the politicians. They have a long way to go in terms of devolution. And one of the crucial issues here in the north is its own jurisdiction. You don't actually go through what appears to be any form of border control when you leave the north to go into the Republic. And that gives a false sense of identity to the north. The north is still partitioned, and it's partitioned appendage to the United Kingdom. And even the language that you will hear, for those of you who are in Belfast for the first time, is a giveaway. I'll give you just one very simple example. You automatically place somebody when they tell you that they're going over for the weekend to the mainland, because they consider the mainland to be the mainland, to be the UK. As one of my very close friends here said, when somebody said that in her presence, you're on the mainland. And that's the difference between those who have a strong identity, strong not only affiliation, but it belong to the island of Ireland, and those who see the north as still partitioned. And of course, you know it all in terms of if you travel through Dublin, because you even change your currency. The banks are different, the currency is different, and of course the legislation is different. The only thing I'm going to say by way of introduction, because as most of you know I can talk forever on the topic, is that I've been researching on prisons for longer than I care to remember, but if I do remember it, it's somewhere in the region of 35 years. And I've been in prisons all over the world, and obviously I've spent a lot of time in prisons in England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. I don't tend to put prisons in hierarchy. Prison is a prison, is a prison, to quote a well-known British Prime Minister who was thinking that when she said a crime is a crime is a crime. No, she wasn't. I'm talking about that, of course. Prisons are prisons, wherever you are. Loss of liberty is loss of liberty. And abolitionists know you can't dress that up. You can make conditions better, but you can't dress up the fact that liberty is lost and the state has taken control of your life, your identity, and even possibly your right to vote. But you can't help but notice the difference between prisons when you enter prisons. You can't help but notice the difference between staff when you enter prisons. The difference between a prisoner's demeanour in one jurisdiction and another. In what I would class as the former Western Europe, and I'm talking about the former Western Europe, the prisons in Ireland and the way in which those prisons operate are the worst, north and south. They're appalling conditions. In the north, of course, it's coloured by 30 years of conflict, 30 years of war. There hasn't been, and this is, I'm not a great one for statistics, there hasn't been one prison officer appointed, one prison guard appointed, since 1993 in the north of Ireland. That was because of the release of political prisoners in 2000. There were so many prison officers left over, some took early retirement, but the prison staff that run the prison service today are the prison staff that run the prison service during the conflict, during the war. The strength here of the Prison Officers Association, the way in which the staff and management work here, and the conditions in which they work. For example, the women's prison is now part of a male young offenders centre. The conditions that they work in are poor, and the staff-prisoner relations are poor. I don't want to labour that point, and I don't want to go on about it, but what we see here is very much a legacy of political imprisonment being imposed on what we would call ordinary imprisonment. And I'll sum it up in one phrase. When Rosie McCauley, who was the officer in charge in the women's prison here of the Republican women, left the prison on that day when a form of amnesty was granted and political prisoners were released, Rosie said, "As we left the prison, I turned to my comrades and I said, I fear for the safety of the women we're leaving behind." Because obviously the one difference between a formalised political prisoner and an ordinary prisoner, who I would still class as political with a small p, the one difference is organisation and strength. And when those women left, they left as an organised, strong body, regardless of the deprivations that they had actually suffered. They had supported each other. But they were leaving ordinary prisoners with no organisation, no sense of solidarity, no camaraderie. And what is more, particularly on the male side, a distance between those who'd been political prisoners and those who were seen as ordinary prisoners, those who were seen as criminals. And the whole movement had been about separating political imprisonment from criminal imprisonment. It created a hierarchy of imprisonment. So it left the ordinary prisoners who were left behind vulnerable. At the same time, it meant that when the political prisoners who left came out, they were not going to fight for the rights of ordinary prisoners. They were going to protect and develop the rights of former political prisoners. This is the only jurisdiction in which there is no prisoners' movement. There is no prisoners' reform movement even. There are 4 former political prisoners' movements. And that speaks volumes for the distinction between ordinary prisoners and political prisoners. It's not one that I'm drawing, it's one that's there in the politics. And as a consequence of this conference coming here, and a consequence of the work that Linda, who's just walked in, Linda and others in this university and outside and in the community have been working on over the last few years, we will be formalising the first ever prisoners' movement that is primarily geared towards the abolition, decarceration of the prisons here in Northern Ireland. And it will be called ActionPrisons. In the same way as one of our cancer charities are called Action Cancer. And I see the two illnesses, imprisonment and cancer, often terminal, as being directly in parallel. So that's all from me. I'm going to introduce now Shad Maruna, who's Director of the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice, but he's also many more things than that. And I will leave him to provide what will always be with Shad, a stimulating 15 minutes or so. Then Agnieszka Martinovic, who is from the Irish Penal Reform Trust. She's going to talk about prisons in Ireland. It's based primarily in the south, but Agnieszka has also a long history in terms of her work on prisons in Poland, but also her work around imprisonment and political imprisonment, and also working for the Human Rights Commission in her previous job here in the north. So she spans not only an international context, but also spans the two jurisdictions, the south and the north. And finally, Robin Wilson, who's going to talk on immigration detention in Northern Ireland. He has recently finished work for the Refugee Action Group on immigration detention here. He's an independent researcher, and he's actually an advisor to the Council of Europe on intercultural, what was the final word? Sorry? Dialogue. I always get it wrong. I always think, the one word you forget is dialogue. Isn't that amazing? How does that happen? He's also on the board of Extern, which is one of the most significant and important NGOs here in the north, but also in the south, but here in the north especially, working with children and young people who are on the margins, and their families, who are on the margins of this society. So, very great thank you to the three of them for opening the conference.